Yesterday, Xi Jinping, head of the government in China, announced that the 53 countries of Africa will, as of some immediate future time, be allowed to export to China with zero tariffs on any of them, on any product. The United States, after it deals with China and after it deals with Russia and South Korea and Japan and the other bigger economies that concern it, will turn its attention.
The world woke up to a headline that no one believed could ever be real: Africa and China united under a 0% tariff trade pact, no tax barriers, no middlemen, no dollar. And for the first time in modern history, two of the world's fastest rising economic forces linked together without asking permission from the West. Overnight, cargo ships rerouted, trade routes shifted, markets trembled. America didn't just lose a business deal, it lost control.
Is Africa likely now in this moment to move economically closer to China?
Absolutely. While the U.S. is raising tariffs on African countries, China has announced that it intends to drop all tariffs for all African countries except Eswatini, which recognizes Taiwan. And China is already Africa's largest trading partner. In 2023, Africa exported about $170 billion worth of goods to the Chinese market. That is 4 times more than the whole of the continent exported to the U.S.
For decades, Washington convinced itself that Africa needed U.S. markets to survive, but now the truth is clearer than ever. It was the United States that needed African resources to breathe: lithium for batteries, cobalt for jets, copper for power grids, grain for global food chains. When Africa stopped playing by old rules and China stepped in with open arms, the balance of power flipped like a switch.
China is pushing a zero-tariff plan with South Africa at the G20. How likely do you see all countries adopting this?
Well, not only zero tariff policy to South Africa. Actually, this June 2025, Chinese government already announced we will give zero tariff to all the African countries with diplomatic ties with China.
This wasn't cooperation, it was disruption, and the U.S. never saw it coming. Because the future of trade is no longer written in Washington, it's being written in Beijing. And it's being powered by Africa.
In a surprising shift, China has unveiled a new tariff strategy: zero tariffs for African nations while imposing a hefty 20% on imports from the EU. This bold maneuver not only redefines trade dynamics, but also signals China's intent to strengthen its influence in Africa. As the global economic landscape evolves, what does this mean for international relations and trade partnerships?
I think we've done it through a number of initiatives, right? There's the Belt and Road Initiative, there's the FOCAC, there's a zero tariff policy in place for African countries, and that enables us to trade in a variety of industries, not just infrastructure, but also agriculture, services even. And I think that this is how we deepen cooperation between the two countries, or between China and the African continent.
The world was stunned when Africa and China stood side by side on a global stage and declared the launch of a 0% tariff trade deal. It wasn't just an agreement, it was a warning. For decades, the United States had assumed it would always remain the center of global trade, the most dominant importer and exporter, the nation that could dictate terms to others without consequence. But the union between Africa and China shattered that confidence in a single announcement. What made it even more shocking wasn't the partnership itself, but the timing. The world economy was fragile, supply chains were stretched, food prices were rising, energy markets were unstable, and just when the United States expected every nation to depend on its wealth and markets more than ever, Africa and China decided to trade freely among themselves without giving America a seat at the table. China had already positioned itself as one of the most powerful manufacturing hubs on Earth, supplying electronics, machinery, vehicles, and industrial equipment to the global market. Africa, in contrast, stood as a treasure chest of raw materials: copper, gold, bauxite, cobalt, rubber, natural gas, grain, and palm oil. For years, these two forces were connected through trade, but burdened by tariffs that slowed growth and kept both sides partially reliant on Western economic systems. The 0% tariff pact didn't just increase trade, it rewrote the world order. Factories in China immediately found themselves receiving African minerals at unprecedented speed and low cost. Ports were suddenly filled with ships moving in both directions without the weight of taxes and trade restrictions. African markets overflowed with Chinese machinery, tractors, smartphones, and solar panels. The cost of production in both economies dropped sharply, and their competitive advantage skyrocketed. What once took the United States decades to build was disrupted in a matter of months. The biggest shock to Washington came when Africa and China announced that they were not using the US dollar for their transactions. A dual currency payment system replaced the standard international trade norms. The news sent ripples across Wall Street. For decades, the United States relied on the dominance of its currency to maintain leverage across the world. If nations traded in dollars, they needed American banks. If they needed American banks, the U.S. had influence. But this time, America wasn't part of the deal. It was locked out. American corporations reacted first. Major auto manufacturers complained of sudden competition from electric car brands backed by China but powered by African minerals. American farmers saw grain exports shrink overnight as Africa redirected agricultural deals toward China under the 0% tariff system. Technology companies felt an immediate blow as African governments, businesses, and universities shifted toward Chinese hardware and AI systems that were suddenly significantly cheaper. The real panic started when economists in the United States calculated the long-term consequences. This was not a one-time deal. It was not a symbolic gesture. It was the creation of a new economic ecosystem, one where America was irrelevant. At conferences and televised interviews, spokespeople in the United States insisted the partnership would not last. They suggested Africa would remain dependent on Western funding, Western investment, and Western financial institutions. But reality unfolded differently. Africa wasn't stepping backward, it was accelerating construction. Cranes filled the skylines of West Africa. East Africa doubled industrial production. Central Africa saw new mining laws that ended decades of foreign exploitation. Southern Africa began exporting finished goods rather than just raw materials. For the first time in modern history, Africa traded value instead of vulnerability. China, for its part, had planned for this moment years ahead. Investments in ports, railways, highways, and power plants across the continent paid off. The infrastructure that the Western world once mocked as unnecessary suddenly formed the backbone of the largest tariff-free trade route outside of Europe. New trade corridors connected copper fields, oil terminals, grain farms, and industrial parks directly to Chinese ports and storage facilities. Cargo moved faster than ever before. Customs systems were digitized, border delays vanished, economic friction disappeared. In Washington, policymakers debated sanctions, diplomatic pressure, and trade warnings, but none of it mattered. The new trade system was self-sustaining. Neither African or China needed permission anymore, and as much as the United States wanted to respond forcefully, it was difficult to attack a deal based on mutual benefit. Africa was not being exploited, it was prospering, and China wasn't controlling Africa, it was treating it as an equal trade partner. America's greatest fear wasn't that Africa and China were trading together, it was that other nations were watching. India took notice, Brazil took notice, Saudi Arabia took notice, countries tired of economic dependency started considering similar deals. The most dangerous idea in global politics is not rebellion. It is example, and Africa had just set one that the world could not ignore. The psychological blow to the United States was visible. American news headlines shifted from skepticism to concern. Analysts warned that if Africa continued on this path, the United States could lose access to key minerals that powered smartphones, electric vehicles, satellites, and military systems. Losing Africa as a trade partner was not just an inconvenience, it was a threat to the entire American industrial future. But Africa was not driven by revenge, it was driven by dignity. After years of being undervalued and overlooked, the continent had found a partner that didn't demand control before offering cooperation. Nations that were once treated as borrowers and resource providers were now treated as stakeholders. Every country wants power, but even more than power, every country wants respect, and Africa finally had it. What terrified Washington most was not that Africa and China had formed a 0% tariff agreement. It was that their economies were now complementing each other so perfectly that breaking the partnership seemed impossible. Africa provided the resources that powered China. China provided the manufacturing that lifted Africa. It was no longer a simple trade relationship, it was economic fusion. And just like that, the world entered a new era, one where the United States was no longer the unquestioned center of global trade. The storm had begun, and America was not driving it, it was being carried by it. As the 0% tariff deal between Africa and China took effect, the shift in global dynamics was no longer subtle. It was loud, unmistakable, and unstoppable. Cargo ships that once arrived at U.S. ports loaded with minerals and agricultural products were now heading in the opposite direction, straight toward Shenzhen, Shanghai, Ningbo, and Guangzhou. For decades, American policymakers assumed that Africa needed Western markets to survive, but they were now witnessing the opposite. It was the United States that needed Africa. The clarity of this moment became even more painful as African nations announced their new export priorities. The first phase was resource protection. Instead of shipping out raw materials at bargain prices, Africa placed limits on unprocessed exports. Copper shipments required partial local refining, lithium shipments required domestic processing, oil shipments came with mandatory investment into local petrochemical plants. Minerals that once left the continent untouched were now leaving as industrial-grade products with amplified value. China, ready to support every step of the transformation, became Africa's biggest buyer and its biggest manufacturing partner. The news spread rapidly. American corporations flooded Washington with urgent letters and memos warning that supply lines were collapsing. Tech companies needed cobalt for batteries and microchips. Defense industries needed manganese and rare earth minerals. Agriculture companies needed fertilizers derived from Africa's phosphate reserves. The United States had built its technological advantage on the assumption that resources from Africa would always be cheap and available. Suddenly, that era was over. A dramatic symbol of change came when a West African leader stood before the African Union and said that Africa was tired of exporting poverty and importing finished goods. The statement echoed through parliaments and business forums across the continent. The message became the new economic philosophy. Africa would no longer be the fuel for other nations' prosperity. Africa would prosper from its own fuel. Once hidden from global conversations, the continent was becoming the center of world attention. Delegations from Europe, Asia, and the Middle East rushed to African capitals seeking new contracts, but by the time they arrived, China had already defined the rules of trade cooperation, not exploitation. Low tariffs, equal partnership, shared industrial investment. Western negotiators tried to push for exceptions, but diplomats in Africa had a new favorite word. No behind closed doors. Panic rose in Washington. Politicians tried to reassure the public that the United States was still the world's largest economy and strongest military power, but none of these strengths could replace lost supply chains. A nation can defend its borders with force, but it cannot manufacture technology without minerals. It can build aircraft carriers, but it cannot build batteries without cobalt. It can hold elections, pass bills, make speeches, but none of that produces resources, and resources were now controlled elsewhere as America scrambled for solutions. Africa and China quietly unveiled their next move: cross-continental industrialization. New economic zones emerged in East, West, and Southern Africa. Joint factories produced solar panels, buses, tractors, electric motorcycles, and industrial-grade machinery made to serve African markets first. African universities partnered with Chinese institutions to open engineering and robotics centers. Ports expanded, airports became logistics hubs. High-speed rail plans emerged. For the first time in modern history, Africa was exporting industrial growth, not just raw materials. Energy also became a major pillar of the new alliance. China invested heavily in Africa's gas fields, hydroelectric dams, solar farms, and geothermal sources. Less energy dependence meant more manufacturing, more agriculture, more infrastructure, more jobs. It was a cycle of development the Western world never expected to witness on African soil. Meanwhile, American media began to shift the narrative. Instead of dismissing Africa, headlines now expressed concern over China's growing influence. But Africans were not blind. They remembered decades when Western aid came with conditions, military pressure, and political interference. The new partnership was not perfect, but it came without humiliation that alone changed everything. Markets reflected the shift. U.S. companies began losing stock value as supply shortages disrupted production. African companies, once treated as fragile startups, became global contenders. Chinese tech firms surged as contracts poured in from African governments and private businesses. Financial markets whispered the possibility that the U.S. dollar could weaken if more nations followed Africa and China in trading outside the American currency system. The real turning point came when Africa and China announced a 5-year development plan centered around 3 goals: keeping more value inside Africa, reducing reliance on Western trade routes, and building a self-contained economic network. Investors from the West begged for access, but access now came at Africa's price, not theirs. Throughout the continent, citizens celebrated the unprecedented economic momentum. From the southern mining belts to the agricultural zones of the east, from the western coastlines to central industrial parks, a new era was unfolding, one defined not by foreign extraction but by local empowerment. It was not just an economic transformation, it was psychological. Africa, long taught to believe it needed help, now realized others needed it more. China benefited enormously, but not at Africa's expense. Manufacturing giant met resource giant, and both thrived. Economic growth surged on both sides. Poverty and unemployment rates in Africa began to fall as industries expanded. Chinese construction firms built facilities that Africans owned. African agricultural exports fed Chinese demand while boosting domestic production. It was a symbiotic relationship that the Western world had never offered. Washington tried appealing to old alliances, but trust had already worn thin. African leaders remembered being lectured but not respected, used but not supported, valued only when convenient. Now the conversations had changed. When American officials asked for access to minerals or markets, the response was diplomatic but firm: trade would happen, but under African terms, not American dominance. Global analysts warned that this partnership could redefine the next century. If Africa continued to industrialize and China continued to scale, the economic axis of the world would shift south and east rather than west. The phrase developing nations was losing meaning. Africa was developing itself without anyone else's permission, and while Washington continued to hope that the alliance would fade, Africa and China were preparing their most consequential step, yet one that would permanently transform global economics and leave the United States with no easy way to stop it. The world wasn't just changing, power was changing hands.